Right now, we are on the brink of a shocking and unfair story. Imagine walking down the street and seeing a police officer pull over a black girl with a disability, but instead of helping her, he is brutal towards her, not even suspecting that her father is an FBI agent. What will happen when the truth comes out? Fear, tension, justice all unfolding before our eyes. What would you do in her place? But before we get into the details of this story, we want to take a little break and get to know you better. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. We are always happy to know who is with us and where you are from. For us, you are not just viewers, you are a real part of our team. Every name you add in the comments helps promote our channel, making it stronger and more important for the entire community. We truly appreciate you and your feedback because it is you who help us continue to create such stories. Remember, your support means everything to us. Enjoy watching. The midday heat hit the city. The hot asphalt radiated heat, forcing people to quicken their pace, just to get to the saving coolness faster. In a quiet area, where a calm atmosphere usually reigned, everything changed today. The sound of a police siren cut through the air, forcing passersby to turn around and retreat reservedly. There was a girl standing on the corner. She looked lost, her thin hands clutching a cane, her face showing fear. Her skin was dark, and that seemed to be what had attracted the attention of the patrol car. She was alone, no friends or family nearby, only the occasional passerby watching the events unfold from afar. The car stopped, the door creaked open, and a tall, heavy-set man in a police uniform stepped out onto the street. His gaze was cold, almost contemptuous. He walked straight up to the girl, not bothering to greet her. "Hey, you!" he shouted sharply, not giving her a chance to say anything. "What are you doing here?" The girl, whose name was Anya, shuddered. Her heart began to beat faster, and her hands involuntarily tightened their grip on her cane. Her lips trembled as she began to explain. "I'm just going home. I live nearby." The policeman chuckled, his gaze darting over her figure. He saw before him not a person, not a girl who was simply going about her business. He saw a black woman. He saw a target to which he could demonstrate his imaginary superiority. "Home?" His voice became even more sarcastic. "In this neighborhood? I doubt it." He stepped closer, ignoring her cane and the obvious signs of disability. His hand grabbed her shoulder roughly, and she staggered. She instinctively took a step back, losing her balance. "What are you doing?" Her voice trembled with fear. "I didn't do anything." But the cop didn't seem to be listening to her at all. He was getting heated, his irritation growing with each passing second. He thought he was in control. After all, he was the law, and she was just another suspicious black girl. "You think you can just hang around here? You think people like you deserve anything better?" He was almost growling, his hand already reaching for her bag. "Show me what you got in there." The girl tried to retreat. Her voice became pleading. "Please, you have no right. I didn't do anything. Please don't touch me." But the policeman was relentless. And then something happened that no one expected. In a fit of rage, the policeman, thinking she was resisting, swung. The blow was brutal and fast. His fist crashed right into her face. She fell to the ground, the cane slipping out of her hands and rolling to the side. The crowd gathered around, frozen horror. No one dared to intervene. The fear of power paralyzed everyone. Whispers began to run along the edges of the crowd, but no one moved. The girl, lying on the asphalt, could barely stand. She felt pain all over her body, but the worst thing was the realization of helplessness. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her cane was too far away. "That's better." The policeman leaned over her, looking with disdain at her lying on the ground. "No need to hang around here. You should know your place." She just sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands. The situation was terrible, unbearable. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst. Suddenly someone in the crowd shouted, "What are you doing? This is too much. She is disabled." The policeman turned, his gaze piercing the crowd like an icy dagger. "Who said that?" he barked, looking at the people, who immediately looked away, pretending that nothing was happening. But then, in the distance, he heard the sound of an approaching car. It was almost inaudible over the roar of the crowd, but for the policeman it was an alarm bell. The policeman stood over the girl, grinning, his chest heaving as if he was enjoying his power and the suppression of those he considered below him. Anya lay on the ground, her face throbbing with pain, blood beginning to ooze from the corner of her lip. The crowd watched in mute horror, but no one dared approach. No one dared stop this man in uniform. Their fear of the authorities was too strong. "Get up, you little devil," he shouted, grabbing her by the collar of her shirt and jerking her up. The girl screamed, her body limply yielding to the policeman's force, but her legs wouldn't obey. He lifted her so far that she hung on his arm like a broken doll. "What, you can't walk?" His sneer was venomous, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you're pretending to be disabled to gain pity? That's typical of people like you." He let go of her abruptly, and she fell to the ground again. Her body shook with pain as she hit the hard asphalt. Anya rolled over onto her back with difficulty, trying to somehow protect herself from the next blow, which she already sensed. She heard her head buzzing with fear, her heart pounding so hard that it seemed to her that she was about to lose consciousness. "Please," she whispered through her tears, her voice weak, almost inaudible. "Please, don't. I just want to go home." The policeman's grin widened. His eyes glittered with pleasure. He enjoyed her fear, her vulnerability. To him, she was just another excuse to be cruel. "Home," he hissed, leaning closer to her face. "You're not going anywhere until I say so. I'm the law, and you'll do what I say." His boot hit her foot sharply. Anya screamed in pain, her body twisted like a spring. She tried to cover herself with her hands, but every gesture was weak and unprotected. She was helpless. The street, her own neighborhood, where she grew up, suddenly became a trap for her. "How about another blow?" the policeman said mockingly, raising his leg for another blow. The crowd stirred, someone screamed, but the policeman only looked back and frowned, suppressing attempts to intervene with the force of his gaze. "Everyone, be quiet," he barked, and his words hit the crowd like a whip. People froze again, someone filmed a video on their phone, but no one dared to approach. Even something seemingly obvious, like the cane lying next to Anya, did not attract their attention. Everyone was paralyzed with fear. The policeman lowered his leg and kicked the girl again, this time in the stomach. The air whistled out of her lungs and she wheezed, desperately trying to breathe. Her vision was clouded with tears and pain, she barely saw what was happening around her, each blow echoing painfully in her body. "Are you just going to lie there like a sack of shit?" he said contemptuously, lifting her up by her hair. He grabbed her wrists, yanking her hands out of their attempts to defend themselves. "Get up!" She was barely able to stand, shaking with pain and terror. But the policeman did not stop, his rage only growing. He swung again, and at that moment she heard an approaching sound. It was something familiar, the sound of a siren, but not a police car. Her consciousness was so clouded with pain that she could barely make it out. The policeman also heard the siren, but it didn't stop him. On the contrary, his gaze became even more cruel, as if he wanted to finish what he started before anyone arrived. "You think someone will save you?" he hissed, squeezing her hand tightly, almost breaking the bones. "You're alone here. No one will save you." He raised his hand to strike, but suddenly something stopped him. A clear, loud voice rang out in the air. "Leave her immediately." The policeman froze. It was not a frightened cry from the crowd. The voice was cold, full of confidence. The policeman froze for a moment, but his face was distorted by a mocking grin. The voice that sounded behind him did not inspire fear in him, on the contrary, it only provoked him. He turned slowly, not letting go of Anya's hand, which was still clenched in his powerful grip. Her face was twisted in pain, and she tried to breathe, gasping for air, but each breath was echoed by a sharp pain in her ribs. "Who's this brave one here?" he said, looking towards the crowd from where the voice came. Another man appeared from around the corner, tall, in a strict black suit, with an expression of calm confidence on his face. The man moved decisively, there was a threat in his eyes, but not the kind that is backed by brute force, but the kind that makes even the most self-confident person stop. Unlike those around him, he did not feel fear of the policeman. "I said leave her," the man repeated, his voice steely but full of controlled anger. "Who are you, a damn smartass?" the policeman said contemptuously, still squeezing Anya's hand. He was in no hurry to let go of his victim, as if testing the boundaries of what was permitted. "This is my job. And you don't interfere if you don't want problems." The man approached, his eyes now completely focused on the policeman. Slowly, almost unnoticed by the crowd, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an ID card with the FBI logo gleaming brightly on it. "I am an FBI agent, and right now you are breaking federal law by using violence against a defenseless girl," the man said so calmly that even for a moment the crowd froze, realizing how serious the situation had become. The policeman laughed incredulously, his face contorted with contempt. "The FBI?" He grinned, not believing his eyes. "What are you going to do? Arrest me? Do you think anyone will believe your words?" He squeezed Anya's hand harder, and she cried out, unable to contain the pain. "She resisted arrest, and I acted within the law." The man in the black suit did not answer immediately. He looked at the policeman with such coldness that for a few moments even the crowd around him felt the air become tense. He slowly stepped forward, coming closer to the policeman, his gaze following his every move. "You have exactly 5 seconds to let her go," the FBI agent said, his voice calm but every word filled with threat. The policeman suddenly realized that the situation was beginning to spiral out of his control. His complacency was beginning to fade, but he still didn't want to admit defeat. His gaze darted between the man and the crowd, and he realized that every phone was now aimed at him, every camera was filming his actions. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said quietly, still squeezing Anya's hand, but already feeling an internal tremor. "I'm just doing my job." But his words were lost in the rustle of the crowd. People around him began to talk, realizing that the situation was changing. Someone shouted loudly, "Let her go! You can see that she's not resisting." The others picked up on this, and the cop began to realize that he was no longer in control of the situation. Panic began to creep into his thoughts, but he still didn't want to give in. Only one thought was running through his mind: "I can't let some FBI agent ruin everything right here." He took a step forward, intending to intimidate the man, but the man remained standing where he was, not moving an inch. The FBI agent didn't even move, and his gaze, calm and cold, seemed to penetrate straight into the policeman's soul. "I warned you," the agent said, drawing his weapon from the holster under his jacket. He didn't point it at the cop, but the movement alone made the crowd gasp. "Let her go, or I'll be forced to use force." The policeman, scared and no longer sure of his rightness, finally let go of Anya's hand. She collapsed to the ground, her breathing ragged, and she almost lost consciousness. Her body shook with pain, and her face was covered in tears. The FBI agent slowly leaned over, carefully pulled her to her feet and helped her sit on the sidewalk. The crowd, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, began to retreat, but the cameras continued to film. "Everything will be fine," the man said quietly, looking at Anya. "I'm here. No one will hurt you anymore." The policeman, seeing the situation slipping completely out of his hands, began to back away, his face red with anger and humiliation. He wanted to say something, but the words would not come. The crowd looked at him with disgust, and the FBI agent continued to stand between him and the girl, protecting her. "You better leave before it gets any worse," the agent said, keeping his eyes on the cop. "You've done enough already." The policeman looked around, realizing that if he stayed, things would only get worse for him. His hands were shaking, and he knew he had lost. The policeman, flushed with humiliation, looked around, his face twisted in hatred. He looked at the crowd, at the FBI agents, at the girl he had just tried to destroy with his brutality. But instead of walking away as he was told, he felt rage rise within him. This was not just a run-in with the law for him. It was personal. He saw before him the people he hated, the black girl who had dared to stand up to him, and the man who had broken his control. "Do you really think you can just show up and save her?" he croaked, unable to contain his anger. "It's none of your business, agent. And you." He turned to Anya, who was still lying on the sidewalk, breathing heavily and trying to come to her senses. "Don't even think that this man is going to save you. You and people like you need to know your place." He stepped forward sharply, clenching his fists, his face twisted with anger. "I warned you," the FBI agent yelled, drawing his weapon and pointing it straight at the policeman. "This is your last chance. Take one more step and I'll be forced to shoot." But the policeman could not be stopped. The same thing was pounding in his head. How dare some black agent threaten me? He saw everything that was happening as a challenge to his authority, and his pride did not allow him to retreat. He spun around, kicking Anya again, sending her body rolling several meters as if she were a doll. Her aching body shook, a hoarse scream escaped her dry lips, and she convulsed from another blow. The crowd screamed in horror, but no one dared approach. "That's it," the policeman shouted, with wild fury in his voice. "Look at her. This is what they deserve. All these blacks. These freaks who think they can mean something in this world. You are nothing, like everyone else." Anya, exhausted by the pain, barely raised her head. Blood was flowing from her nose. Her mouth was broken, and she could barely open her eyes because of the swelling. Her weak fingers tried in vain to find her cane, but it was too far away. She lay on the asphalt, and every breath caused her unbearable pain. However, she still heard those words, those racist remarks that dug into her heart like insults. "You fucking deserve it," the cop yelled again, his voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. "I was right all along. You're all fucking criminals. You'll never be equal. Never." He raised his hand, intending to strike again, but at that moment a deafening shot rang out. The policeman froze, his body staggering. He looked down and saw blood pouring from his shoulder. His face was twisted in pain and surprise. He couldn't believe the FBI agent had actually fired. His world seemed to be crumbling as he fell to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder. "I warned you," the agent said coldly, raising his weapon higher. His face remained calm, but his eyes were filled with hatred. "You've crossed the line." The policeman, stunned and maddened by the pain, looked at the agent. His lips were trembling, but he still could not comprehend that someone had dared to go against him. Despite his condition, he forced out a contemptuous smirk. You think this will change anything?" he croaked, almost choking on his own blood. "People like you will always be crushed. You're trash. She's trash, and no one will ever truly stand up for you. You shoot, and then what? Nothing will change." His words were full of venom, but it was the venom of a dying beast, desperately trying to bite one last time. The crowd stood in deathly silence. Everyone realized how terrible the situation had become. The violent scene that had unfolded before their eyes showed how deep hatred runs and how far racism can go when unleashed. But no one dared intervene. Fear was stronger. The FBI agent lowered his weapon and slowly walked toward the officer, who was still kneeling, clutching his wounded shoulder. The man looked down at him. "You've not only lost your form today," the agent said, his voice quiet but everyone in the crowd could hear every word. "You've lost your humanity." He turned back to Anya, who lay nearly unconscious on the sidewalk, her breathing ragged and her body still shaking with pain. The agent crouched down next to her, gently lifting her head and holding her close, trying to calm her down. "Everything will be fine," he whispered, but even he wasn't sure it was true. The policeman lying on the ground was still trying to get up, his gaze clouded but full of hatred. "You," he muttered, but his strength left him and he sank to the sidewalk, unconscious. Sirens, which had been barely audible before, now filled the street. The police and ambulance finally arrived, and at that moment the crowd began to part, making way for the approaching cars. But for Anya, everything that was happening was already blurred, as if in a fog. All she saw was the shadow of the policeman who, until the last moment, tried to destroy her because of her skin color. The policeman lay on the sidewalk, wounded, but his eyes still blazed with hatred. The blood dripping from his shoulder did not stop his anger. He rose, staggering, trying to grab onto something to get to his feet. His face was twisted, and his lips were twisted into a feral grin. "This isn't over," he croaked, his voice rough and muffled, like the growl of a cornered animal. "You think you can all get away with it? I'll show you." He lunged forward, using his last strength to strike again. His fist shot out toward the FBI agent's face, but he was ready. The cop missed, and the agent, acting quickly, threw him off balance, throwing him to the ground. The crowd seemed to freeze, unable to believe their eyes. But the policeman did not stop. Even on the ground, he continued to shout offensive racial insults, his voice breaking into a hoarse rasp, but his rage remained unbroken. "You black bastard scum," he growled angrily, trying to get back on his knees despite the pain in his wounded shoulder. "I will kill the likes of you as long as I have the strength. You will never be equal. Never." His face twisted in anger, and despite the wound, he rose to one knee, then tried to stand up. but then his gaze darted to Anya. The girl lay on the sidewalk, curled up in pain, her face pale, and her eyes full of terror. Her breathing was ragged, and every movement caused unbearable pain. Her fragile body was even more vulnerable to this monster. The policeman suddenly lunged towards her, intending to strike again, no matter what, with his foot, his fist, or even his own sick body. His racist hatred had consumed him completely, depriving him of any rationality. For him, this had become a personal war against everything he hated, and Anya was his target. He grabbed her hair roughly, yanking her head up so that her neck was bent into an unnatural position. She cried out in pain, but her body was too weak to resist. The policeman hit her again, his fist connecting with her jaw, hard enough to send her head crashing to the pavement. Her scream was short, barely audible, and she passed out. The crowd stirred. Someone shouted, "Stop him! He will kill her!" But no one moved, paralyzed by the horror of what was happening. The policeman seemed to feed only on their fear, his eyes glittering with madness. "Look at her!" he shouted, as if addressing an audience. "That thing deserves every ounce of pain. They all deserve it." He raised his foot, preparing to kick Anya, who lay lifeless on the pavement, her face disfigured by bruises and wounds. But before his boot touched her body, another deafening shot rang out. This time, the bullet passed through his thigh. The policeman screamed, his body falling to the ground next to Anya, but even that didn't stop him. He tried to pull himself towards her, like a wounded animal leaving a bloody trail on the sidewalk. His lips were still moving, screaming hateful phrases, but his strength was leaving him. He tried to hit the girl again, but his hand only fell powerlessly next to her. The FBI agent jumped at him, yanking her hair out of his hand, and roughly flipped him onto his back. The cop was in agony, but even on the brink of complete impotence, he continued to spit racial slurs. "You will never understand. You will never understand what it means to be above the likes of her," he wheezed, his eyes clouded with pain and hatred. The agent raised his hand, clutching his weapon. His face was tense, and in his eyes there was a struggle between the desire to stop this horror and his duty to the law. "You've lost," he said quietly, looking the policeman straight in the eye, "and you'll never raise your hand against the innocent again." The policeman wheezed, his eyes closed, and he sank into unconsciousness from loss of blood. The ambulance and police finally arrived on the scene. The paramedics ran to Anya, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher, her body covered in blood, her face disfigured by blows. She was unconscious, and no one knew how serious her injuries were. The crowd slowly parted, shocked by the brutality and violence they had witnessed. The crowd stood in complete silence. People watched as the paramedics placed Anya's body on a stretcher, her face unrecognizable from the numerous blows. Her small, mutilated figure seemed even more fragile. The whole situation was permeated with an atmosphere of horror and helplessness. Whispers interspersed with heavy sighs. No one could believe what had just happened. The policeman lay nearby, bleeding, but his hatred, even through the pain, was visible on his twisted face. Even in his unconscious state, his body seemed to be trying to move. In the last convulsions of violence, the two other police officers who had just arrived on the scene looked at each other, unsure how to react to what had happened. One of them approached the FBI agent, who was still standing, gun in hand, his eyes fixed on the racist cop. "We'll take him into custody," one of the officers said carefully. His voice was shaking and there was fear in his eyes. "We'll handle this." The FBI agent slowly put his gun away and looked back at the crowd. People stood in shock, in silence, as if they were still waiting for some next horrific turn of events. Camera phones continued to roll, capturing every detail. This moment had already gone viral. Racism, violence, blood, and a desperate fight for justice. "That bastard deserved what he got," the agent said coldly, his voice heavy and controlled. "But no bullet can erase what he did." His words hung in the air, causing gasps from the crowd. No one wanted to believe that such a thing was even possible. A police officer, armed with power and force, beating a defenseless, disabled girl because of her race. But here it was, right before their eyes. Anger, shock and fear boiled in the minds of all witnesses. While the police were arresting their colleague, carefully trying to place him on a stretcher, the paramedics were lifting the stretcher with Anya's body and preparing to take her to the ambulance. Her face was hidden by an oxygen mask, and her body was almost completely covered by a white blanket. Her condition looked critical, and in the eyes of everyone who looked at her there was an unspoken hope that she would survive. As the paramedics were about to leave the scene, a hoarse voice burst out from the crowd. "He must answer for this," the man shouted, his fist raised in the air, his face red with anger. "This is racism in its purest form." "How long will this go on?" another woman screamed, her voice shaking with rage and tears. "How many more of our children must suffer? How much more blood will be spilled?" The crowd began to groan, their suppressed fear giving way to mounting anger. People shouted at the police, demanding justice. Each of them sensed that this was not just a random act of violence, but something deeper, the systemic racism that permeated society. The FBI agent looked at the crowd, at the people who could no longer remain silent. He knew that their righteous anger was justified, and at that moment he felt the same weight on his shoulders. This was just one of many, and no matter how many similar stories happened, nothing changed. "We have to go," the FBI agent said to the medical staff. "Every second counts. She might still survive." The paramedics nodded and wasted no time in closing the ambulance doors, which immediately sped off, taking Anya to the nearest hospital. The FBI agent was left standing alone in the middle of the street, his gaze focused on the bloody footprints left on the asphalt and the crowd, which continued to seethe with anger. "This day will be the beginning of the end," he whispered under his breath, not taking his eyes off the road down which the ambulance disappeared. One of the policemen, apparently a senior officer, approached the agent, trying not to meet his eyes. "We'll figure it out. I understand," he muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The FBI agent looked at him with cold contempt. "You'll sort it out?" he repeated, barely containing his anger. "This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last. How often do you sort it out while people are being beaten up in the streets?" The policeman looked away, his face turning white. "That's true," he said slowly, "but we have to obey the law." "The law?" the agent barked, unable to contain himself. "The law was broken when your man laid a hand on a defenseless black girl. The law was crushed under his boots when he threw her to the pavement because she could not defend herself." The crowd began to make noise again, supporting every word the agent said. People were shouting for justice, demanding that every guilty person receive the punishment they deserved. The policeman retreated, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation. The agent looked out at the crowd again, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. He knew this was just the beginning. The ambulance carrying Anya sped off into the distance, leaving behind the noisy cries and indignation of the crowd. And in the heart of the FBI, anger flared up. He understood that his work was just beginning, and that now he was responsible for ensuring that this story did not go unnoticed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to Anya, who had lost consciousness. Each of them knew that time was against her. Her vital signs were alarming. Blood had leaked from her nose and was spreading across the sheets, and her frail body was unresponsive to stimuli. The doctor assessing her knew that this was more than just physical trauma. This was the result of the systemic violence that so often leaves people like her on the margins of life. "We must act quickly," the doctor said, looking at the nurse. "She has multiple injuries, and she cannot be left unattended for a second." Anya, in a state between life and death, was a victim not only of violence, but also of a system that did not protect her. She was a disabled black woman who constantly faced bias and misunderstanding. Her life was not easy, a constant battle with people's prejudices, a lack of resources and services available to people with disabilities, and the harsh reality of racism. Every blow, every derogatory comment she had ever heard in her life was now burned into her memory. Her body, which had always seemed so weak, was now her prison. She couldn't run, she couldn't defend herself, and now, in her most vulnerable position, she found herself a target for those who were supposed to protect her. Meanwhile, at the police station, the situation had worsened. The policeman who had attacked Anya was still lying on a stretcher, his wound requiring urgent medical attention, but his pride was even more wounded. He was furious, looking at his colleagues who had surrounded him. "I won't let this go on," he cried, trying to rise, though his shoulder was swollen and bandaged. "I'm not a bastard. She should have known her place." His words were full of hatred, and even his comrades didn't know how to react. Some of them looked at each other, confusion in their eyes. This policeman was more than just a villain. He was a symbol of the problem that permeated the entire system: bias, hatred, and violence, all combined in one man. You've crossed all boundaries, one of the more senior officers said, trying to restore order. You need to understand that we can't ignore this any longer. Your behavior was unacceptable. The policeman froze, looking at his comrade with contempt. You also think she was innocent? He barked, raising his hand to his chest. She was just a piece of meat that prevents normal people from living. I just cleared the streets of trash. These words caused a wave of indignation among those present. Several policemen began to whisper among themselves, and even in their own circle there were voices of discontent. This man, whom they had once considered their comrade, had become a disgusting disgrace to the uniform. "You can't say that," one of them shouted, stepping closer. "She's a human. She's not trash. You couldn't protect her when she was so vulnerable." The policeman stood up despite the pain, looking at his colleague with hatred. He did not want to accept any accusations. The desire to justify his actions was growing in his head. He was ready to do anything to save his honor. "It's all a lie," he shouted, his voice furious. "You all know it. I hate them, and I always will." Meanwhile, back at the hospital, doctors began working urgently on Anya. Her condition was worsening, and they knew every second mattered. Her injuries weren't just physical, she carried mental pain that she would have to overcome even if she survived. One of the nurses tried to talk to her when she came to for a moment, but the horror she had experienced was still too fresh. "Anya, I'm here," the nurse said, trying to calm her down. "We'll help you. You're safe." But Anya, barely opening her eyes, found herself in the same hellish circle again. She saw a policeman beating her, and she couldn't get rid of this vision. Each blow left marks not only on her body, but also in her soul. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't touch me." Her words sounded like a cry for help, and they weren't just words, they were her despair, her fear that she couldn't overcome. It was a struggle that was going on in her mind, and every memory of what had happened brought a new wave of pain. Meanwhile, divisions continued to rage within the police department. Some officers began to speak openly about the need for reform, that such racism should not be the norm. These were conversations that had never happened before. But there was still someone who defended the system, who did not want to see the truth. The racist policeman, sitting back on the stretcher, refused to admit his mistakes. He did not see that his actions had led to grief not only for Anya, but for many others who had faced similar hatred. "Nothing changes," he muttered, looking out the window. "They'll always be like this. It'll never end." Every word came out of his mouth with such hatred that even his colleagues began to feel uncomfortable. His endless insistence on racist views was overwhelming. He was not about to realize that his actions had already become the beginning of the end not only for him, but for the entire system that supported such hatred. That same night, news channels began discussing what had happened. Images of Anya, mutilated and bleeding, filled the screens. People across the country began taking to the streets, raising their voices against violence, racism, and the system that had tolerated it for so long. It was a story that needed to be told, and it wasn't just about Anya. It was a story about everyone who has ever felt vulnerable, everyone who has been victimized by a system that sometimes protected the wrong people. The only sounds coming from the hospital were the machines, but Anya's mind was still filled with screams and images of her tormentor. She relived that horrific moment over and over again when the police officer, without waiting for an explanation, pushed her roughly, leaving her no chance to defend herself. Each blow was not just physical violence for her, but also a symbol of how society rejected her as a woman and as a disabled black person. Her family was in the dark at the time. The mother, who had always cared for her daughter, felt a heavy heart when she heard about the incident on the news. She dropped everything she was doing and rushed to the hospital, praying that her daughter would be okay. With every step, her heart sank with fear. Would they have to face the prejudice they had faced their entire lives again? Meanwhile, the police officer who had beaten Anya was at the police station, frustrated and refusing to admit his mistakes. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was the victim, that his life was now under threat. He continued to insist that his actions were justified, that Anya was not someone to feel sorry for. This wasn't just madness, it was a sick logic, rooted in the racist stereotypes he had absorbed since childhood. She could have been dangerous, he shouted at his colleagues when they began discussing the incident. "You don't understand what they're like. They create their own problems." Some officers began to exchange glances, their expressions showing discomfort, but no one dared to speak the truth out loud. The fear of being judged by their comrades and the system they defended paralyzed them. At this point, the system showed its weakness. Brothers in arms could not speak the truth when it was necessary to put aside their pride. At this time, Anya, in a state of confusion, opened her eyes again and saw the familiar face of the nurse. The woman tried to calm her down, but Anya could not cope with the terrifying memories. Even in this safe place, she felt trapped. Her fear was as strong as at the moment of the attack. "I can't," she whispered, her voice weak. "I can't forget what happened. He was so strong, and I couldn't do anything." The nurse leaned closer, trying to convey her support. "You're safe now, Anya. We're here to help you," she said, hoping that her words would somehow comfort the girl. But Anya did not feel safe. Even at this moment, she was filled with anxiety. Every time someone entered her room, she felt that it was him, a policeman who could raise his hand against her again. Every time, she felt fear squeeze her heart, and this fear was not only from physical pain, but also from a deep feeling of powerlessness inherent in all who have become victims of the system. Despite the efforts of the doctors, her condition continued to deteriorate. Her vital signs were fluctuating like a flag in the wind, and every second passed with tremendous tension. But even in this moment of fear, where her body was fighting for life, her mind was full of hopes and dreams that she would never be able to realize. She dreamed of one day becoming independent, being able to go out without fear, and now all this seemed unattainable. When her mother finally arrived at the hospital, she saw her daughter on the bed, pale and exhausted, and her heart was breaking with pain. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she held Anya close, trying to show her that everything would be okay. But Anya still felt that this world was unfair, and her soul was still shackled by fear. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't know how to cope with this. I'm afraid to go outside again. I'm afraid of people." Her mother hugged her, trying to hold her close, as if that could protect her from everything she had been through. Her heart fluttered with the desire to protect her daughter, but she knew that even her love could not completely protect her from the prejudice and hatred that reigned in society. "We'll find a way to get through this," she said, her voice full of determination despite her own tears. "We'll fight, and you're not alone. I promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you." But deep down, both women knew that justice might be out of reach. Each faced a system that had long been blind to the suffering of those who did not fit into the standard mold. This was not just one family's tragedy, it was the beginning of a long, difficult fight for rights, for life, for justice. Soon after the incident, as the public outcry began, Anya became a symbol of that struggle. People across the country took to the streets demanding change, demanding justice for all who, like Anya, had been victims of violence and racism. Their voices rose as one, rising above the noise of hatred. The movement became a story about how victims can become a voice for change, and even if Anya herself could not yet understand the full force of her situation, her suffering awakened the hearts of many who could no longer remain in the shadows. While Anya and her mother were struggling with the trauma, a storm erupted at the police station. The officer who had beaten Anya sat in his office, trying to collect his thoughts. He refused to accept responsibility for his actions, but then his eyes fell on a news headline on his computer screen. Word had already spread about the attack on the disabled black woman, and word soon came that her father worked for the FBI. This news shocked him. At first he could not believe that it was true. He did not think that people like them could occupy high positions, but then fear pierced his heart. He knew that if it was true, his actions could lead to catastrophic consequences. His entire inner world began to shake with anxiety. In his mind, he imagined how his life could change in an instant. What if this FBI agent decided that he had to answer for his actions? What impact would that have on his career? He had always considered himself untouchable. But now, if that was true, he was a target. "Damn," he muttered, clenching his fists tightly. "He can't be that important. It's just an accident." With each passing moment his paranoia grew, and he imagined FBI agents coming for him, arresting him for the crime he had committed. He began to justify himself. "I was just doing my job. It could have been dangerous." At that moment, he felt fear creeping up on him. He knew that the system did not always protect its people, especially when it came to racial issues. His actions had become public, and the consequences could be dire. He decided that he had to act to protect himself. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Anya continued to recover her strength, but her fear did not leave her. Every time someone entered the room, she flinched. Her mind continued to dwell on that night, and every rustle, every shadow reminded her that her life had been changed forever. When her mother finally left the room, Anya was alone for a moment, filled with horror at the memory. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. She looked up to see her father, an FBI agent, walking into the room, determined and angry. "Anya," he said, his voice firm, "I'm here to protect you." Her heart fluttered with fear and joy at the same time. She knew that now she had someone who could help her, but the fear still did not leave her. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I'm scared. He might come for me again." Her father, understanding her fear, came closer and sat down next to her. He took her hand, and at that moment Anya felt warmth, but this warmth could not displace the shadow of fear. "I know what you've been through, and I can't believe this happened to you," he said, pain in his voice, "but I promise we'll get justice. This man won't get away with it." But at that moment, the racist cop, having learned that Anya was the daughter of an FBI agent, felt his fear turn to rage. He could not believe that his life now depended on the man he had humiliated. A plan began to form in his head. He decided that he had to do everything possible to get out of this situation alive and unharmed. "I won't let this agent ruin my life," he whispered under his breath, refusing to accept the fact that his actions could have serious consequences. He gathered his colleagues and began discussing how they could extinguish the situation before it became too loud. He knew that if this reached the media, he would be lost. They had to act before it was too late. "We'll just say it was an accident," he suggested, looking at his comrades. "No racism, no violence. We were just doing our job, and she didn't comply. We can just brush it under the rug." Some officers began to doubt, but his confidence and persistence silenced them. They knew this incident could lead to a lot of trouble, but no one wanted to deal with the wrath of a racist cop who had already proven his worth. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Anya and her father discussed how to deal with the situation. He explained to her that they could file a complaint and have the case investigated. Anya felt that her voice was getting stronger, that she was no longer alone, but the fear that they might run into that policeman again haunted her. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking again, "I don't want this to happen again. I don't want him to ever know where we are." Her father nodded, understanding her fear. He knew that now, as they began to fight for justice, they had to be careful. The policeman's terrible act made them both think about how vulnerable they were in this world where hatred still had great power. "We'll be careful," he assured her, "but we can't just let this go. I'll protect you, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." There was anger in his eyes, but also determination. He knew that now he and Anya had to fight not only for their family, but for everyone who suffered from such violence. This wasn't just their fight, it was a fight for justice, to give a voice to those who had been silenced, and though fear still gnawed at them, together they were ready to face it. As Anya and her father discussed how to deal with the dire situation, the cop finally realized that his world was beginning to crumble. Rumors that Anya was the daughter of an FBI agent quickly spread throughout the department. He began to lose confidence in himself more and more as he realized that his actions could cause a real storm. The hatred and rage that once gave him strength began to dissipate, giving way to fear. The policeman decided he could no longer remain inactive. He stood up and walked out of his office, unable to bear the thought of the consequences of his actions. Deep down, he knew that if Anya and her father decided to file a complaint or even open an investigation, his career and possibly his life would be in jeopardy. He got into his official car and drove to the hospital. His mind was racing with thoughts about how he needed to talk to Anya, how he needed to convince her that he was not the person she was made up to be. The fear that he could lose everything he had was unbearable. He didn't realize that his actions were not only wrong, but also terrible. When he got to the hospital, his heart was pounding with fear and tension. He knew he had to be careful, and maybe it was best to just apologize. He walked into Anya's room, a worried expression on his face. "Please, listen to me," he began, barely catching his breath. "I know you hate me, and I understand why, but I need you to understand that I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just doing my job." Anya, seeing him, felt her anger overwhelm her. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything she thought about him, but instead she froze, amazed that he had come at all. "You have no right to come here," she screamed, her voice shaking with emotion. "You beat me. You made me a victim." The policeman, standing in the doorway, felt panic creeping up on him. He knew what he had done, but he was vulnerable now, and this feeling was new to him. He had never felt anything like this. His pride, his confidence, had been shattered. "Please," he said, his voice shaking, "I'm begging you, just leave it alone. I didn't mean to hit you. I have a family. I can't lose my job. I can't lose everything." Anya was shocked. On the one hand, she felt satisfaction that he was on his knees, but on the other, her heart sank with the knowledge that he did not realize the horror he had caused. "You think your life is more important than mine?" she asked with disdain. "You beat me up, and now you want me to feel sorry for you? Don't you understand what I've been through? Don't you understand what I've been through?" The policeman, hearing her words, suddenly felt everything inside him turn over. He began to realize that not only had his actions damaged the lives of others, but now that he was face to face with the consequences of his actions, his own life could be destroyed as well. I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice shaking with fear. "I didn't think it would affect my life. I didn't mean to be a racist. I don't know what happened to me." Anya watched him as he sought her forgiveness in desperation. Her heart sank, but she couldn't let him go without consequences. She felt that this situation wasn't just about her, but about everyone who had been the victim of systematic abuse. "You have to answer for your actions," she said firmly. "You can't just come here and ask for forgiveness. You have to understand that what you did has consequences." At that moment, the policeman began to lose control of himself. He realized that Anya could really be the only person who could decide his fate, and fear overwhelmed him with renewed vigor. He looked at her, his eyes full of tears. "Please, I beg you," he sobbed, losing the last of his dignity. "I will work on myself. I promise that everything will change. I don't want to lose everything I have." Anya, watching this humiliation, understood that now she had a power that she had never felt before. It was a strange and terrible feeling to see how the man who once personified her fear now fell to his knees before her. "I can't promise that everything will be okay," she said, her voice full of strength and determination. "You have to not only acknowledge what you've done, but you have to work on yourself to change the system. This isn't just about you and me. This is about stopping the violence and the hatred." The policeman, realizing that his life would never be the same, nodded, his eyes full of despair. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore." Anya, looking at him, understood that in this terrible situation there could be an opportunity for change, but until he took responsibility for his actions and began to change, her fight for justice had only just begun. The policeman, standing at the threshold of the room, began to realize the gravity of the situation. He learned that Anya was the daughter of an FBI agent, and this news shocked him. Every word she said now took on new meaning. He understood that his life could turn upside down in an instant. "Please, Anya," he said, his voice shaking, unable to hide his fear. "I didn't know you were an agent's daughter. If I'd known, I would never. I don't want this to get back to your father." Anya, looking at him with contempt, felt her anger begin to fade, giving way to an understanding of his fear. She was confused. How could a man who had caused her such pain beg for mercy? Conflicting feelings raged in her heart, but she could not allow herself to soften. "You think your fear is more important than mine?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage. "Have you ever wondered how you felt when I was lying on the ground, unable to move, and you were just looking at me?" The policeman, seeing Anya's anger growing, began to panic. His knees were shaking, and he began to realize that he was trapped. He was no longer just a policeman, but a man who had hurt the daughter of an FBI agent. He couldn't afford it. I'm asking you," he began, his voice darker, full of despair. "You have to understand that I have a family. I can't lose my job. If your father finds out, it'll be the end of me. I don't want him to know." Anya felt her heart squeeze. Deep down, she knew the policeman was scared, but that didn't excuse her. She looked at him, his eyes full of tears and fear. "You made a choice when you hit me," she said firmly. "You didn't think about your family when you hurt me. Why should I think about you now?" The policeman, realizing that time was running out, began to panic. He began to run through the options in his head: how to save himself, how to get out of this situation unharmed. He knew that he did not have much time left, and if Anya told her father, it would be the end of him. I can help, he said, trying to hide his panic. I can do something useful. I can start working on change. We can hush this up. Just give me a chance. I beg you. Anya felt the policeman's fear mingle with her own. She watched him, seeing him lose control, and it scared her. She didn't know what to expect from the man who had beaten her, but she couldn't let him get away with it. How can you undo what you've done? She asked, her voice sharper. You can't just come along and say everything will be okay. You have to understand that your actions have consequences, and you have to bear them now. The policeman, having lost all hope, continued to beg. Please, I don't want this to reach your father. He mustn't know. I can work on myself. I can learn. I can change the system. Anya looked at him, her heart full of conflicting feelings. She felt a struggle going on inside her. She had to fight for justice, but at the same time she saw a man in front of her who was scared and desperately seeking forgiveness. Do you really think I can believe you? She asked. Do you think your words can erase the fear you brought into my life? The policeman, realizing he could no longer justify himself, hung his head. He knew his life depended on the decision she made. He was just a policeman, but now his career and his freedom hung in the balance. I promise I'll be better, he said, his voice full of despair. I don't want my world to fall apart. I don't want my family to suffer because of what I did. Please, give me a chance. Anya looked at him, and understanding arose in her heart, but she knew that she could not let this man go without consequences. The decision was not just about her and her fears, but about all those who had ever been victims of violence and racism. I can't just turn a blind eye to this, she said firmly. I can't let this go on. I'll tell my father, and he'll do everything he can to make you answer for your actions. At that moment, the policeman felt his breath catch. He knew it was the end. All his hopes were gone, but deep down, he knew that this wasn't just his personal drama. It was a reflection of the system that had allowed him to do what he had done, and now he was ready to pay the price. Anya stood in the room, looking at the policeman who was finally beginning to realize the seriousness of his actions. Her thoughts were filled with contradictions when she suddenly heard a familiar sound, footsteps approaching her room. Her heart began to beat faster when she realized it was her father. She knew that his presence could change everything. The door swung open and her father, an FBI agent, walked in with a determined expression on his face. He looked at Anya and then at the policeman standing in the corner, looking wary and afraid. At that moment, the tension in the room reached its limit. What's going on here? He thundered, his voice commanding, making the policeman shudder. Anya saw the fear that enveloped him like a shadow, and it gave her confidence. Dad, she said, trying to sound calm, even though her emotions were raging inside her. He came to apologize. Her father, still tense, moved closer to her, his protective presence. He knew that not only his daughter's safety was at stake, but justice as well. Apologize? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. You beat up my daughter, and now you think you can just come along and fix it? The policeman, realizing that his backup had just disappeared, began to panic again. He desperately searched for words that could change the course of events. I didn't mean to hurt her, he said, his voice shaking. I didn't know who she was. I was scared. Scared? The agent said loudly, his voice even more menacing. You beat my daughter just because she's black and disabled? You think that's an excuse? Anya felt pride fill her as she watched her father stand up for her. His strength and confidence gave her courage. She knew that with him by her side, she was not alone. I understand that I made a mistake, the policeman continued, his voice shaking as never before. I can change everything. I can start working on myself. Just give me a chance. The FBI agent wouldn't leave him alone. He stepped forward, and the cop stepped back, feeling cornered. Do you think that's all you need? Just say a few words and leave? You don't understand how you ruined my daughter's life. His voice became furious, and rage lit up his eyes. You have no right to forgiveness. Anya, seeing her father protecting her, felt her fear fade away, giving way to hope. She knew that together they could fight for justice. Dad, she said, her voice quieter but determined. He has to understand that his actions have consequences. He can't just walk away. The policeman, realizing that he had already lost, began to rush around the room in panic. Please, I'm ready to do everything. I'll be better. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want my life to be ruined by this situation. The agent, paying no attention to his words, continued to look at him with contempt. You don't understand that it's not about keeping your job. It's about being held accountable for your actions. You have to understand what true responsibility is." The policeman, feeling the world slipping away from under his feet, began to waver. He realized that now he could not save himself if Anya and her father decided to file a complaint. He was afraid, and this feeling overwhelmed him. "You can't just walk away from this," the agent said, his voice calmer but filled with determination. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you answer for what you did. This isn't just forgiveness, this is justice." Anya, feeling the support of her father, knew that together they could achieve justice. She was not going to leave it like that. "You hurt me," she told the policeman, her voice full of confidence, "and now I will do everything I can to prevent others from suffering the same way. We cannot allow people like you to go unpunished." The policeman, realizing that all his chances were gone, began to tremble with fear. He no longer looked threatening. His confidence was completely gone. He was simply a man who realized that everything he did could lead to the destruction of his life. The FBI agent couldn't help but feel proud of his daughter as she grew stronger. He knew that together they could change something in this world, even if it was difficult. At that moment, he realized that their fight was not only for Anya, but for everyone who had ever suffered from violence and racism. The policeman, surrounded by fear and despair, finally gave in. He realized that the only way forward was to admit his mistakes and try to change his life. But could he really change? Time will tell, but now his life is forever changed. The FBI agent, feeling anger and a desire for justice for his daughter, realized that a simple apology could not be the end of the story. He stood looking at the policeman, and a decision arose in his heart. He knew that this man's action not only destroyed his daughter's life, but was also a reflection of a much deeper problem in society. This was not just a matter of one family. It was a matter of principle that he was ready to defend to the end. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to sue you. You'll answer for your actions." The policeman, hearing these words, turned pale, his eyes widened with fear, and he retreated as if he were in mortal danger. "No, please," he cried, despair etched on his face. "You don't understand what this means. This will ruin my career, my life." The FBI agent, ignoring his pleas, continued to look at him with cold determination. He knew this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice and preventing others from suffering the way his daughter had. "You must answer for what you have done," he said firmly. "I cannot allow people like you to go unpunished. You beat up an innocent girl simply because of her race and her condition. This is unacceptable." Anya, standing next to her father, felt her pride grow with every word he said. She understood that he was protecting not only her, but also everyone who had become a victim of violence and prejudice. She moved closer to her father, feeling his support. "Dad, I want everyone to know the truth," she said. "We have to make sure that this policeman understands the consequences of his actions. No one should suffer because of people like this." The agent, looking at his daughter, felt her strength inspire him. He knew it would not be an easy road, but he was ready to fight for her and for everyone who faced racism and violence. "I will work with the lawyers," he continued, "and we will achieve justice. We will make sure that this case becomes an example for others. Anyone who suffers from bias and violence should know that they are not alone." The policeman, realizing that his powers were exhausted, continued to plead. "I will work on myself," he cried, his voice full of despair. "I promise I will change. Please, don't sue." But the agent, paying no attention to his pleas, continued. "You already made your choice when you beat my daughter. Now it's time for you to answer for your actions. I will not allow you to hide behind your uniform and your power." Anya looked at her father with pride, knowing that he was defending not only her rights, but the rights of all who had suffered at the hands of injustice. She felt hope ignite in her heart, hope that they could change things for the better. "We will not remain silent," she said, looking the policeman in the eye with confidence. "We will make sure that your actions are known. We cannot allow this system to continue to ignore cases like this." The agent nodded, supporting his daughter. He knew their path would be difficult, but they were not alone. He was ready to take action, and together they could overcome this challenge. "I'll contact the lawyers and start the process," he said, confidently clenching his fists. "We'll make you answer for your actions, and this will be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can do this with impunity." The policeman, realizing that his time was up, dropped his notebook, which was part of his identification card. he realized that his whole life had been turned upside down, and his only way out was to admit his mistakes. I'm ready to cooperate, he said, already losing confidence in his words. I don't want everything to end like this. I'm ready to tell the truth about what happened. But the agent and Anya knew that this was just the beginning. They had a long and difficult road to justice ahead of them, but they were ready to go to the end. At that moment, they realized that their fight was not just for personal interests, but for all those who were subjected to violence and racism, and together they would achieve the changes that this society needs. The trial began in a large courtroom, where the atmosphere was tense and full of anticipation. Anya sat in the front row, holding her father's hand. She felt her heart pounding with excitement. This was an important moment, not just for her, but for everyone who had experienced injustice. The room was full of people, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who had come to support Anya. Each of them understood that this case could become a landmark in the fight against racism and violence by law enforcement. Anya glanced around the audience, and her eyes met several familiar faces, friends and supporters who had come to support her in this difficult moment. The entrance to the judge's chamber was majestic and intimidating, and here he was, the judge, dressed in a black robe, with a serious expression on his face. The judge looked at those present and began the session. We are beginning our consideration of the case in which the plaintiff, Anya, accuses the defendant, a police officer, of causing her physical and moral harm, he said, his voice loud and confident. Let's move on to the first witness. Anya found herself in the witness box. She took a deep breath and stood up, feeling the eyes of many people on her. As she stepped toward the stand, she felt her nerves rising, but she knew she had to be strong. Please tell the court what happened, the prosecutor asked her, his voice friendly and supportive. Anya began to tell her story. She talked about how she was walking home with friends, how a policeman suddenly jumped up to them, began to threaten and, finally, hit her. Her voice trembled as she described her feelings, her pain and suffering. I just didn't understand why it happened, she said, holding back tears. I never thought I would be subjected to violence just because of the color of my skin and my condition. I felt defenseless. The courtroom fell silent. Anya noticed some of the spectators rubbing their eyes, trying to contain their emotions. Her story had touched the hearts of many. After her testimony, the prosecutor called other witnesses. They described how Anya suffered after the incident, how long it took her to recover not only physically but also mentally. Some witnesses were Anya's friends who were with her that evening. They confirmed her words and spoke about how this incident affected their lives. Anya listened to them, feeling supported. Each witness gave her confidence, and she understood that their struggle made sense. Then it was the defense's turn. The policeman came to the stand, and Anya's excitement returned with renewed vigor. She couldn't help but hate him for what he had done, and at the same time she understood that this was his chance to justify himself. I didn't mean to hurt her, he began, his voice shaking. I was acting on the circumstances. I had a job to do. The judge interrupted him. Excuse me, but explain how exactly your actions were consistent with your duties. Hitting a defenseless girl is not what we usually expect from a police officer, is it? The officer was clearly nervous, his confidence beginning to crack. He began to talk about how stressed he had been that evening, how he had been worried about his safety and the safety of others, but his words fell on deaf ears. The prosecutor asked questions that were difficult to answer, questioning his actions and motives. Anya watched him with distaste, feeling her anger turn to determination. This man should not get away with it. He said he was under pressure, but no one had protected her that night. The trial lasted for several days, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Anya and her father worked together with their lawyers to present evidence and memories of what had happened. Each witness, each new fact brought them closer to their goal of achieving justice. One day, the psychologist who treated Anya after the incident appeared in the courtroom. She spoke about the consequences of the trauma, how difficult it was for Anya to return to normal life, how she suffered from constant fears and anxieties. She wasn't just physically hurt, the psychologist said. This incident has destroyed her soul. Every time she sees a police officer, she is overcome with fear. It is a trauma that could last a lifetime. The psychologist's words touched the hearts of the people in the room again. Anya felt everyone present begin to realize how much she was suffering. This struggle was not only hers, but also everyone who had experienced similar situations. At the next hearing, the police officer finally began to admit his guilt. Although not directly, he said he understood that his actions were inappropriate and that he regretted what had happened. However, his excuses still sounded like an attempt to avoid responsibility. The FBI agent sat next to his daughter, watching the officer's every move. He felt his anger rising, but he knew they had to stay strong. This was their fight, and they couldn't afford to give in. With each passing day of the trial, Anya felt herself becoming more confident. She understood that this wasn't just about her, but about the fight against bias and violence. She knew that no matter the outcome of the trial, their story would be heard, and that was something important. It was something that would help others who were suffering the same injustice. The trial continued, and each day brought new emotions, new challenges, and new hopes. Anya was ready to fight for justice, even if it meant walking through fire. She knew that with her father by her side, they could overcome any difficulty, and this battle was only the beginning of their journey to change. The trial was drawing to a close, and the tension in the courtroom was running high. Each hearing brought new evidence, and emotions ran high. Anya and her father, full of hope and fear, waited for the judge to make his decision. However, much to the dismay of everyone following the case, strange events soon followed. At the final hearing, the prosecutor made a statement that left everyone in shock. "I regret to inform you that the police officer charged in this case has disappeared," he said, his voice grim. "We have attempted to contact him to give a statement, but all our efforts have been fruitless. He has not been seen since the trial began." Anya froze, feeling her heart skip a beat. She and her father exchanged worried glances. It was unexpected and frightening. How could a person just disappear into thin air, leaving no trace? "You mean he ran away?" Anya's lawyer asked, his voice full of bewilderment. "He beat up a girl and just disappeared?" The prosecutor nodded and continued, "We cannot say that he escaped, but we have reason to believe that he tried to evade responsibility. We have filed inquiries with local law enforcement agencies, and they have launched an investigation. However, at this time we have no evidence as to where he may be." Silence fell over the room. Everyone present felt the tension that hung in the air. Anya felt her anger boiling. She had dreamed of the policeman being held accountable for his actions, and now he had simply disappeared. "How can this be?" she said, unable to contain her emotions. "He beat me up, and now he just left. How is this possible?" The FBI agent, sitting next to his daughter, was determined. "We'll make him answer," he said, his voice firm. "If he got away, we'll find him." This isn't over yet, but hope for justice began to fade. Each day spent waiting for news of the officer's whereabouts seemed like an eternity. Anya felt helpless and frustrated. She wanted her story to be heard so she could help others who faced similar situations, but without punishment for the officer. This seemed impossible. As the weeks turned into months, the trial finally came to an end. The expected verdict did not come, and Anya was left with a feeling of incompleteness. She saw many people come to support her in the courtroom, but now their hopes seemed dashed, too. Meanwhile, the prosecutor continued to search for the policeman, and rumors about his possible whereabouts spread throughout the city. They said that he might have left the country, that no one would see him. However, despite all efforts, no trace was found. Anya understood that time was not standing still. She could not afford to remain in this state of limbo. Together with her father, she began to actively participate in human rights events, telling her story and raising questions about racism and police violence. She realized that even though the police officer was missing, their fight for justice was still going on. Every time she spoke to an audience, her words resonated with people. Anya realized that she was not alone. There were others who suffered from bias and violence behind her. Gradually, she began to gather like-minded people around her. People who had also experienced similar traumas began to come to her events, and together they formed a community ready to fight for change. Anya understood that the police officer might not be punished for his actions, but they could make sure that such incidents did not happen again. She knew that the fight for justice was a long road, but she was ready to walk it together with others. They began to hold protests, demanding police reform to prevent violence and bias. Anya felt that despite the disappearance of a police officer, they were not just fighting for their history, but for a future free of fear and injustice. As time went on, Anya realized that she had become a symbol of hope for many. Her story inspired people to take action, and each new day brought new opportunities for change. They may not have known what happened to the police officer, but they knew one thing: their voice would be heard, and they would not stop until they achieved justice. Despite all the difficulties, Anya and her father continued to fight for justice. Over time, their movements began to attract the attention of the media and the public. Anya became an active participant in many actions, where her story inspired others to talk about their experiences and demands for change. They organized charity events and educational programs aimed at raising awareness of racism and law enforcement violence. Anya spoke to crowds, sharing her experiences and calling for a more humane approach from the police. Every speech she gave resonated with people. She saw so many eyes shining with hope, and it gave her strength. Over time, results began to appear. The community organizations that supported her began working with local authorities to push for police reform. They insisted on the need for racial bias training for officers, as well as the creation of mechanisms to monitor police actions. One day, after one of her speeches, Anya approached her father. He was smiling, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it," he said. "You inspired people, and even if the policeman was never found, you changed a lot of lives." Anya nodded, knowing that their fight had not been in vain. Even without the policeman being punished, they had managed to draw attention to issues that had gone unnoticed for so long. She knew that this was just the beginning, and their movement would only get stronger. A few months into their active work, changes began to take place in the city. The police announced new initiatives aimed at improving relations with the community. Civil rights became an important part of police policy. Anya knew that changes would not happen overnight, but they began to move in the right direction. Over time, Anya became a symbol of the fight for justice. She spoke at conferences, gave interviews, and continued to share her story to inspire others. Her voice became a powerful weapon against racism and violence, and she knew she would not stop until she saw real change. Eventually, she began to think about the future. With each new action, with each new ally, her hope that the world could be a better place grew stronger. Anya realized that her journey was not only about personal justice, but also about creating a society free of bias. One day, standing in front of a group of people at a rally, Anya said the words that became her motto: "We will not be silent, our voices matter, and together we can change this world." The room exploded with applause. She looked at the faces full of hope and determination and knew that their struggle was not in vain. Every step, every word brought them closer to a more just society. In that moment, Anya felt that her story, despite all the grief, had gained new strength. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them with an open heart and determination. And even if the policeman was never found, she realized that justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it just means keeping fighting, keeping talking, and keeping doing. Anya looked to the future with hope. Her story was continuing, and she knew that together with others, she could change the world for the better. And although the road was long, she believed that every step toward justice mattered. Thanks for the opportunity to write this story. If you have any other topics or ideas you'd like to discuss or expand on, let me know. We hope you enjoyed this story. We really want to know your opinion. What do you think about what is happening? Have you ever encountered racism in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are really important to us, and we appreciate each of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it so you don't miss new stories. Have a great day. Thank you for being with us.